As journalists and television hosts, scripts are a lifeline. Each newscast, each story, it all revolves around a script.
But now it's time to go unscripted. That means we're not just going off script, we're throwing out the script altogether.
Each week, we're joined by fellow Farm Journal hosts and editors to peel back the layers on stories we've shared throughout the week.
Unscripted. It's real, it's raw, it's entertaining, and it's your chance to meet the personalities behind the personalities. I'm Tyne Morgan.
And I'm Clinton Griffiths. Welcome to Unscripted.
Welcome to Unscripted. A big thank you to our sponsor, BASF, before we get started with this edition of Unscripted. And, you know, in the promo, in the beginning, in the intro, it talks about real, raw, entertaining. And Glenn, today's going to be all three for sure.
I was going to say they're going to get their money's worth because it truly is unscripted. You and I rolling in here like with the power slide and, dragging our tires, squealing the tires a little bit, trying to get this show pulled together. And I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's kind of a different pace. I mean, right now we're covering, there's so much happening on the policy front. You go back to Friday, Clinton, and you had, EPA come out with their renewable fuel obligations, those volume obligations, and that sent soybean oil prices just surging. And then we had the strike on Iran, and we look at what happened to fertilizer prices. I mean, it's so much to try to keep up with right now on the policy front and war and the impact on prices. And there are some, producers definitely in the South, as we look at the rains, as we look at the struggles, you look at commodity prices, there's so much to follow right now. This is kind of a break from it all. And we're going to be breaking down some madness today. Absolute madness.
Well, and I think that's where the day-to-day stuff, we all deal with it, right? Like we've got to ride the wave of what's happening day to day and try to keep up on the latest news and policy and markets and all of those things. But there's also some head scratcher stories out there that make all of us just sit around and go like, really? This is what's happening? And so I'm excited about today's story from that standpoint, because I think there's quite a bit of that going on, and we're going to touch on some of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the definition of what the Sigma. Every time I read a story by this individual on our team, I say, what the Sigma? So let's bring them in now. A well-known face and voice and name here on the Unscripted podcast with Chris Bennett, and then a newbie that we're excited to introduce, Josh Windham. You want to bring them both in, and we can get this conversation started.
Welcome, fellas.
Hey, y'all.
Good morning. Hey, it's a privilege to be on here with both of y'all.
Chris, now we know your background. We know yours. Well,
wait,
we're starting to learn that you're maybe off of the no-fly list,
the rocker. Wait, before we even get started with that, Chris. So you had a couple recent stories. Are you in the witness protection program? Why are you so dark in the background? Like, what is going on?
It's like in the middle of the day.
Are you in your? We need to know.
Chris is in his.
I'm on here with Josh Windham. So being on here with Josh Windham, I got to blur out everything because this man has a target on his back. I don't want any shrapnel hitting me.
Too late, Chris. Too late.
Josh, tell us a little bit about what you do. Introduce yourself. Tell the audience a little bit about what you do so that they'll start to connect the dots, I think, once you do that.
Sure. Okay. Nice introduction that I have a target on my back.
Hey, that's a compliment. That's a compliment, Josh.
Yeah, well, hopefully it is. So I'm a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice. IJ is the national law firm for liberty. We litigate nonprofit cases in defense of economic freedom, free speech, educational choice, and private property rights. And I am the co-director of our project on the Fourth Amendment, which means that I defend people's property rights using the Fourth Amendment as a shield against unreasonable government searches, surveillance, entries of their property, that kind of thing. And for whatever reason, over the last 5-ish years, a bunch of my cases have involved government officials going onto people's private land or even in their buildings in some cases. And Chris Bennett has, of course, covered a lot of my cases in his stories over the years. But I have sort of become the national guy on, can government officials put on camouflage and roam around people's private property without a warrant? And I say no, and government officials like to say yes. And so that's kind of where the target on my back comes from.
And you end up in court.
I do.
And yeah, a lot. And I think that's the intersection of what we're looking at here, Tyne, is that the private property rights, our farmland, open fields, like where does all of this intersect and cross, and what are the real rights that our farmers and ranchers and private property owners have? And I think that's why, Chris, when you write a story, it gets so much attention because you have an assumption and then you have what is reality. I mean, and I don't know, Tyne, that's the way I read it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of our viewers who are farmers and ranchers would say, Josh, you're fighting a good fight. Fight for them right now. But let's go back, because that's what you do today. But at what point did you decide this is what you want to do? I mean, were you sitting in law school and something about the government just really pissed you off and you decided that this was your calling in life? Like, how did you?
You just love the Fourth Amendment? Was it just your favorite?
Yeah. Is that really just what stuck out to you?
Oh, it's all of the above. I mean, I'm a libertarian. And so in law school, I was a libertarian, and I still am. And, the big picture pitch, a limited number of things it should be doing. Largely that involves protecting us from foreign invaders and protecting us from each other. And so I was pretty outraged going throughout law school, seeing the government doing a lot of things that were predatory of its own citizens. And one of the things that really jumped out to me as a way you could push back on that was the Fourth Amendment. Now, interestingly enough, when I started my career at IJ, we didn't have a Fourth Amendment project. We didn't do a ton of Fourth Amendment work. But I sort of pushed this idea that, hey, the Fourth Amendment is an amazing way of defending people's private property rights. And so in 2021, we launched our Fourth Amendment project, and we've been off and running ever since. But I'd love to tell you how I got interested in the open fields issue that you're alluding to, because it's a story that was not intentional. This happened almost entirely by accident. So
okay, well, I think actually let's go to our first segment, because this is leading us perfectly into talking tea. Okay, Josh, we want the D.
Do it. Josh, right. Tell us that story. I want to hear it.
So how did this happen? All right. So it was 2020. So, COVID's happening and all that. And we get this alert from what's called a docket tracking system, which is, as a lawyer, looking into public interest cases that are going to have the potential to set big precedent and help a lot of people. We track different cases that are going through the federal and state courts. And we got this notification about a case in the Western District of Tennessee involving a man named Hunter Hollingsworth, who owned a farm out there. And Hunter is a hunter. And he had discovered a state wildlife agency camera on his private property, on his posted private farm. And it was hanging from a fishing line in one of his trees. Now, at the time, he didn't know whose camera this was. He had never seen it before. It didn't have any identification on it. And so he took the camera down and brought it to his house. And then government officials proceeded to raid his house and accuse him of stealing government property by taking that camera down. So Hunter sued in federal court and said, hey, spying on me on my property with a camera without a warrant violates the Fourth Amendment. It prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. And so, I should be protected by this, right? You guys should have to pay me damages for violating my rights. And his case was dismissed by the court under a rule called the Open Fields Doctrine, which I'd never heard of. But the basic idea of the Open Fields Doctrine is that 100 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court says that the Fourth Amendment doesn't provide any protection at all from unreasonable searches, warrantless searches, searches without probable cause. It's just zero protection. So what that means is that government officials can go onto your property whenever and however they please and conduct unlimited, unchecked surveillance of you from your own land. And so Hunter's case was dismissed. The court in that case analogized his property to basically the same as a public park under the Constitution, which is outrageous, right? Because it is private land. The whole reason to have it is that it is yours. You get to pick who comes on and who doesn't. And so Hunter then got with us. We learned about his case. We reached out. We learned that his neighbor, Terry Rainwaters, had been experiencing the same kind of thing, cameras on his property, warrantless patrols by camouflaged government officials who were spying on them from behind bushes and taking photos and using nets to sift through their ponds and just all sorts of, extensive surveillance of their farms, one of which has actual, homes on it. Terry Rainwaters lives on his farm. And so we sued in state court under the state constitution and said, look, whatever the U.S. Supreme Court wants to say about the Fourth Amendment, surely Tennessee's constitution doesn't have to follow this crazy rule. And so, there's probably a lot to unpack about how that case went and what we learned, but that's how I learned about the issue. And now I've been down the rabbit hole for about 5 years, and I have 5 cases about this. So.
Josh, I think and I know I've talked about this with Chris before. I think one of the things that's most interesting in this open field, you said, what is 100 years old precedent that the courts follow, but we didn't have trail cams and cellular trail cams. We didn't have drones. We didn't have all of the new technology for surveillance that we have now, that you can do it remotely. It feels like it's time to update this. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think the federal open fields doctrine was wrong when it was decided, and it's more wrong today because, the tools that law enforcement officers have available to them now to conduct surveillance, expose us to a lot more pervasive, intrusive surveillance than might have been conducted, 100 years ago. The original case, the Hester case, was in 1924. It was about prohibition officers going onto a farm by foot. But as you say, now they've got drones, now they've got cameras. I'm sure that 5-10 years from now, we'll have some new surveillance technology. And the point is that once you tell government officials, you can do whatever you want to people on their land. There is no privacy on land, no matter what they do, no trespassing signs, no matter fences, none of that matters. You've opened Pandora's box, right? There really are no limits at that point.
Josh, I can tell the government officials love you. Chris, have a question for you. As Josh is telling all these stories, and good thing I wasn't on camera because I don't have a poker face. It is just mind blowing to me. But Chris, as you uncover some of these stories, what are the why? Why are these government officials even putting cameras on these property? What are they trying to what do they want to see?
Don, let me say first that Josh Windham is an absolute champion in this country for protection of the Bill of Rights. He does things in the courtroom that no one else is doing. And he's put a light on what we're talking about like no one else has, literally since, the 1920s. And in these cases, Josh is involved in all of them. As he said, multiple states. We're talking now Tennessee, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Alabama. I may have even forgot one.
You got it.
You see the same thing, or at least a theme over and over, and that is the government feels it simply has the right, as in that's just the way things are, to have open access to someone's private land. And when I say open access, that's precisely what I mean. That's not hyperbole. In other words, you have game wardens, and it's just game wardens right now, but this applies to all, as in 100% of government officials. They all get access to your private land. I believe it was in 1984, the second time they argued this. This was a marijuana case in 84. Josh mentioned the one in 24, which was alcohol and revenue officers. 84 was police and marijuana. And in that case, in the Supreme Court, in testimony, the government admitted they don't even need, let me emphasize this, they don't even need reasonable suspicion, the absolute lowest bar, reasonable suspicion. Don't even need that to go on to your property. And once owned, they can stay as long as they want. And it starts becoming darkly comical, because you might be listening to me talking right now and say, what does that mean that they can come on and stay as long as they want? But that I meant what I said, at least according to the Supreme Court. And then also, when they get onto your land, what are they allowed to do? Pretty much anything they want. In other words, if the EPA officials wanted to come onto your land and take a sample of your soil and use that evidence against you, all done without warrant, according to the Supreme Court, that would be legal. And Josh, let me throw it over to you, please. If they come on, regardless of what type of official it is, if they come on to your land and they do find evidence, what literally, physically happens to that evidence, and what can they do with it?
Well, I mean, they can use it to prosecute you, right? So some of the officials in these cases admitted in their deposition testimony when I asked them, do you ever take things from private property? Do you ever take samples? Yeah, I'll take samples. I'll like I said earlier, they'll take a net and sift through a pond and try to find samples of what they think is bait. They'll test the soil. Chris, you mentioned the EPA. They of course do this, but game wardens do it too. They'll test the soil for substances that they think hunters use. Will try to attract wildlife. Baiting laws are different in every state. Food plot regulations are different in every state, and so it kind of varies state to state. But they'll take things from these properties, including game itself, right, and then bring it back and then use it as evidence to prosecute people. And it's not just, I want to make very clear, it's not just they're taking natural things from people's properties. I have a client named Josh Highlander in the Virginia case that Chris mentioned. And I mean, his story is wild, but the officials went to his residential neighborhood in Providence Forge, Virginia. I mean, we're talking single family homes. This is not like a big rural forested area. It's lined with single family homes down to like a quiet residential street. He has about 10 acres. They park in a cul-de-sac and get out of their truck, and they all put on leafy jackets, if you know what those are, right? And so there's 3 officials wearing camouflage and leafy jackets. They fan out. They walk past his no trespassing signs through the back of his property. They go up to his food plot, which is legal in Virginia. You can have a food plot in Virginia. And they see a camera in the middle of his field, which is just a few hundred yards from his house. And they take the camera. And then they look through all the photos, and they've held on to the photos. They've given the camera back, but they copied all the photos. They have all the photos downloaded, and they're using the photos to try to prosecute him and look back in time and say, 3-4 years ago, you might have done this, you might have done that. And it's like they're using his own camera to retroactively spy on him.
Wild. What, Josh, and you kind of, maybe you've alluded to it here, but what has surprised you the most since you started pulling on this string? Since you began kind of this mission, this quest, this, really pursuing some of these types of cases, is there anything that stands out? You're like, I just can't believe this.
I just think the mentality of the game wardens has been the biggest thing for me. I depose all these officers personally. I'm not one of those lawyers who just handles appeals or just handles trials. I do it all, right? So I file the case, do the depositions, do the appeal, argue the case at the state Supreme Court. So it's kind of front to back. And in the front end of it, when you're doing the depositions, like I will ask every single one of these game wardens the same kind of questions. In fact, they know the questions are coming because I've had depositions where they'll tell the official I'm deposing, the attorneys will, go read the deposition from the Rainwaters case, right? And so they'll prep with prior depositions that I've done, and they're still not ready for these questions. And the questions are simple. How much power do you have? Are there any limits on your power, right? Do you need a warrant? Do you need consent? Do you need to give notice, right? And they'll say, no. I have as much power as I need. There are no limits on my authority. If I ask them, can you identify constraints on your discretion? Anything at all that constrains your discretion when you're on somebody's private property? Nope. And I say, what about a warrant? Do you get a warrant? No, and I don't need one, right? So there's always an added level of like, not only do I not need this permission from the courts, right? How dare you ask me whether I need permission from the courts? So there's a kind of almost like a hubris, right? Like, who am I to question the power that they have? And honestly, I'm not there doing anything other than saying, tell me what you do. Tell me how much power you have. And they're delighted to tell me they have unlimited power, which is the whole point we're making.
So do you have more people contact you than cases you can take on? I mean, are there, we've been following through Chris. He's been bringing to light some of these issues, but do you have more people inquiring about this than you actually have the manpower to handle at this point?
I would say we get more submissions than we take for a couple of reasons. Generally speaking, we try to only represent folks who have like pretty clean records, right? Because it's courts are emotional creatures too, right? They're just people, they're just judges, they're human beings in robes, and like they want to root for the good guy. And so finding folks who have clean records or sympathetic stories are going to be better and more effective than finding folks who are, prolific poachers or whatever, right? Not that poachers don't have rights either, right? I mean, it's whether you're a criminal or non-criminal, you have the same constitutional rights against this kind of warrantless intrusion, but people want to root for the good guy. I will say, though, that part of the issue we have, and this is not just limited to the open fields question, but just our work more broadly, is it's extremely, extremely scary to stand up to the government. And I will not tell you which of our clients have had trouble with this because it would be outing them. But I've had a few clients, including in our open fields cases, who at the last minute decided, like, I don't want to do this. I'm afraid of retaliation. I'm afraid of the government coming after me. I'm afraid of what they'll do to my family. I mean, local politics is actually pretty corrupt in some places. Yeah. And so like that, of course, hasn't happened. They all kind of got the steel and the fortitude to say, you know what, this is important. I'm not just standing up for myself, but I'm standing up for property rights throughout my state for millions of people, for millions of acres of private land. Like that's really important. It's an opportunity few people get. But the reason we don't have people knocking down the doors for us to represent them is that people are afraid to stand up to the government when they have this kind of power.
Josh, I want to ask. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Jump in here.
Josh, could you, somebody's listening to this and they're saying, hey, in my state officials can't do this. I'm protected by the state constitution. They might be right in that particular state, but they're not protected federally. Can you explain the difference, please?
Yeah. So the federal constitution sets what we might think of as a floor for people's constitutional rights. Okay. So the Fourth Amendment is sort of the baseline that all officials in the country have to follow, federal, state, and local, right? So if the Fourth Amendment protects something, every official in the country has to follow that protection. The thing is, if the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say that the Fourth Amendment just categorically doesn't apply to land at all, then the question is what's left? And fortunately, we have 50 other constitutions in the state, in the country, right? Every state has its own unique constitution. Every one of those constitutions has its own search and seizure provision that is similar in phrasing, though not identical to the Fourth Amendment. And so what's amazing is that you can go into state court and ask state courts to say their constitution does not follow the federal open fields doctrine, whether because of a textual difference or because of a historical difference or something else. And if the court agrees with that, if the court says, you know what, our constitution does not follow the Fourth Amendment open fields doctrine, every state official in that state is going to have to follow that rule. It doesn't bind federal officials because of something called the Federal Supremacy Clause in the U.S. Constitution. Federal officials don't have to follow state constitutions, unfortunately. But victories on this front under state constitutions are effective against state officials. And honestly, that's the most important part of this because state officials have the most manpower in each state. You don't have U.S. Fish and Wildlife with the boots on the ground power to just patrol every piece of private property across the country. They rely on state officials to do a lot of this work.
Wow. I want to ask you this question, Josh, and I don't know if it's a fair question or not, but I'm going to ask it. Do we actually have private property rights? I mean, is there such a thing as private property in this country, or is it just areas of gray?
No, I think the U.S. Supreme Court is pretty good on some property rights issues and not good on others, right? I think one example of where they've been good recently is the issue of takings. So you had a case involving an agricultural property a few years ago called Cedar Point Nursery versus Hester. That one was litigated by the Pacific Legal Foundation. But the issue there was basically labor unions had authority under, I think it was a California regulation or a statute, to go on to agricultural properties. And these are private entities that are given authority to enter private farms, right? But that was pursuant to state authority. And what the U.S. Supreme Court said was, look, if you're going to have a statute that authorizes people to go onto a private property, that is taking their right to exclude, their property right to exclude intruders from them. And so that is a taking under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So there are other contexts in which courts are pretty good on things like property rights and the right to exclude. It gets a little tougher when we talk about the Fourth Amendment and surveillance because of some of this old precedent we've been talking about today. But I think it's, is it gray? Yes, but only because there are places where it's good and places where it's bad.
Okay.
We will be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Veltima fungicide outyields the competition by an average of 7 bushels per acre. But you've never been average. The only competition that really matters is you versus you. And with the performance of Veltima fungicide from BASF, you can take your best results even further. Beat your own record. Get every bushel you deserve. And make this your best season yet with Veltima fungicide from BASF. Always read and follow label directions.
Let's go to our next segment, Clinton, because I have another question, but I think it fits within the next segment. What the Sigma? Okay, before we get into this segment, I just want you to know, Chris, that your Game of Horns story, I still have 10 years about. Okay, that's just not right at all.
Twisted. I mean, there's a lot of questions that you know, it's one thing to be obsessed over antlers. It's another thing for a fella to have some sort of undisclosed fetish and everything that goes with it over antlers. And if
Question
anybody
is
wants
just,
to
look
read
at
that
Josh's
very
face. He's like,
I
twisted
wish I knew
story.
what you were talking about. This is
I'm Josh.
fascinating.
We have to send you Chris's story. It is. I mean, give just real quick. Give us the dirty, Chris. What's the story about?
Oh, please do give us the dirty.
Several years ago, not too long ago, there was a series of deer being poached on some southern Iowa farmland, which is not that unusual, except that this was in rapid succession. They were found decapitated over and over. Again, not that unusual, but it happened bang, bang, bang. And so a particular game warden named Craig Roberg, very sharp guy, got on this poacher's trail. And it, come to find out long term, what this cat was doing was he wasn't poaching to sell the horns. He wasn't poaching for social media acclaim, anything. He was obsessed over antlers, and he had them in a barn type structure, and he had a chair that he would put in there and be surrounded by all of these antlers. And he had a severe fetish, and I knew about the fetish right off record. And so I wanted to ask Craig, hey, could you explain the details of the fetish? And make a long story short, they were too horrid to actually put into print. I'll leave it right there.
You can't.
Yeah.
Oh no. You are not.
We don't need more details.
Oh yeah, we do.
No, we
yeah,
don't.
we do.
No, we
Because you
don't.
didn't conclude it in your story that's what this segment's about. Chris, can you just give us a hint to something you couldn't include in that story because it was so horrid?
Yeah. You know, I don't know the exact degree of sexual fetish you would put with something like that, right? But there was an element of that, an element of twist. And frankly, look, of all the outdoor stories that I've come across, I'd never heard of anything like it in my life. I'm sure it exists. There are, wild hunting tales that involve such, of course, but I guess I'd never come face to face with it. But the story by itself of just this fella poaching over and over and this game warden on his tail trying to nab him is quite fascinating by itself.
Yeah.
And one of the key points was that when they found this guy, and he had, I think it was 40, 50, 60 racks, it was a lot. When they caught him, none of those racks were monster. In other words, there was nothing that you would hang on the wall in a museum or to boast about. They were all within the realm of normalcy. And that spoke also to this fella's obsession. And I remember that when they'd actually nabbed him and they had him in the chair and they were interrogating him about these racks, the ones that he didn't care about were the roadkill. In other words, he had found a lot of them via roadkill, cut them off and took them home, which I think is illegal by itself. But anyway, he wasn't worried about losing those, but the ones he had taken himself, fella's heartbroken. And most of the everybody knows most of these fellas return, right? Dog returns to his vomit. So I reckon the fella's still popping things. That's just
Dog returns
speculation.
to its vomit. Oh.
Don't you, Zach, do not use that as the headline for Unscripted this week.
Well, I have a question about this though, Chris. I mean, if I go into ChatGPT, I've never heard of this fetish. If I go into ChatGPT and I say like horny for horns, like am I gonna get like a detailed explanation of this fetish?
Chris, you need to start asking Josh for your headlines. That was pretty good.
That
pretty good.
was very, very good. Yeah, that's. I'm gonna guess you do encounter that kind of thing. Yeah, there was a guy that was rumored. I can't remember, y'all. It seemed like maybe it was in. I'll just dump it in Arkansas. Maybe it was in southeast Arkansas. I don't know this for a fact of the location, but it was some hunting club where this fella constantly killed the biggest buck every year, killed several. And none of the other guys could figure out what he was doing. And a rumor broke out, right? I'm just telling you what everybody knows the story, that the guy was taking his wife's sanitary products and lining them at the bottom of his deer stand. And some of his buddies claimed that it was pulling in bucks, and then he was killing them.
Oh my gosh.
Now, I'm just running my mouth here, but there's a lot of directions you can go.
I've heard of planting sugar beets and stuff, but not the
Oh
other.
my gosh, this is wild. And he knew where all of those horns came from, right? He remembered, he could tell you where each one was and what it came from and like the whole backstory on hundreds.
We had a relationship with them.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, what the Sigma headlines, you wrote a story over the last, I think it's been 2 weeks ago or a week ago, that has kind of turned into, the amount of following and reads that it's gotten has just been unbelievable. Tell us about this story, and I'm just going to read the headline. I'm going to let you take off. City government to seize 175-year-old farm by eminent domain and replace it with affordable housing. Boy, that's caught a lot of attention.
Right. Yes, sir. It was a fellow named Andy Henry. It's ongoing right now. Andy, his great-grandfather bought land in 1850, and the farm is still in operation there in New Jersey. It's a 21-acre farm, 175-year-old farm. And over the last 20 years, Andy and his brother who own it have turned down offers of $20 million, $25 million, up to $30 million for the 21 acres because it's now surrounded by essentially warehouses, distributorships, and so on. But he's held on, turned down the money. He's simply interested in legacy and passing it on, period. But the city, which is Cranberry, that's in Middlesex County, approached him several months ago, sent him a letter and said, hey, we're going to take your land and we're going to put up government housing, right? We're going to take your pasture, put up concrete, put up apartment units. And there it is. So he'll get bottom dollar for it. And that'll be that. And the farm will disappear. So I simply summarized what has happened. And by the way, the township council, the ones responsible for this, wouldn't speak to me. And they also have not declared what sort of government housing is to go up. In other words, what specific type of affordable housing is supposed to be there, which I don't believe. I frankly think they're not being straight. They may not technically know, but they know. So he is going to fight this. He has an attorney. And a lot of people said, hey, Andy, if you can prove that you've had family members buried there since 1850, that might be a way to save it, or put it in a trust or some kind of historical registry. I don't know what direction it's going to take, but yes, when the public, right, left, everyone found out that the city council is going to take 21 acres from this fella, 175-year-old farm that they protected. You can imagine what they went through generation after generation to lose it for government housing. That's what's going on. And I don't know what direction it'll take, but yeah, it's got massive amount of interest.
Josh, how does that strike you as you hear that compared to some of the stuff that you've been following?
Pretty outrageous. I think, one of the things that, without knowing a ton about the legal background of this case and like what stage it's at, the Fifth Amendment does allow the government to take property through eminent domain, but it's got to have a public use for that property. And so, the traditional way of thinking about public use is like some kind of like a park or a highway, right? That kind of thing. Or like a right of way for a railroad that the public is going to have access to. Something like public housing, this is, of course, the government has a role in our modern economy in providing welfare to people. But it strikes me as a little bit odd that you would say it is a public use to take property from one person and just sort of give it to other people, right? And that sort of seems like what's going on here. It strikes me as constitutionally suspect at the very least, and sad. Sad for this family and the folks who have had this farm for, it seems like generations.
Josh, do you think that one of your cases, you got them in multiple states, these open fields cases, do you think that one of those will end up before the U.S. Supreme Court? And how do you see that shaping up with the composition of the court right now?
So our cases are all designed to rely exclusively on state constitutions over which the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction. And that's a design. Our goal is to spend a few years spending a bunch of time in state courts, creating a bit of a domino effect in the state courts to kind of create a chorus of new courts saying, you know what, we've taken a fresh look at this issue, this 100-year-old issue, and we're not going to follow that old approach. Our goal would be, once we've had enough victories, to then go to federal court, then take a case to the U.S. Supreme Court and say, look, a bunch of these states have said no. They've looked at this with fresh eyes, and they've said, you know what, this 100-year-old rule that you adopted doesn't make any sense. It never did. And we ask you to reconsider it. And I think with the current composition of the court, even assuming we were to get to the court sooner than later, I think it's hard to really assess our chances because the court today is very obsessed with constitutional text. The alleged basis of the federal open fields doctrine is that the word land is not in the Fourth Amendment. That's kind of where it supposedly comes from. The thing I'm optimistic about, though, is that we had a conference last year on the open fields doctrine at our headquarters here. We had a bunch of scholars come in on the Fourth Amendment, and out of that conference have come a few papers. One of which is by a really prominent scholar named Laura Donahue, a Fourth Amendment scholar who works at Georgetown Law. And she wrote an article that's about to be published about this old Hester case, about the open fields doctrine, about why it's wrong. But part of what she explains in her article is that the word houses in the Fourth Amendment is being construed far too narrowly as basically four walls, a roof, and that ring of land around the house that we call the curtilage is kind of a technical concept for it. But her argument is, if you go back to English common law and look at the history of all this, in fact, the idea of curtilage was a concept that extended all the way to the farthest fence or the farthest ditch of your property. And so if you just want an example of that, think of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello or George Washington's Mount Vernon. These are sprawling estates, right? These are farms. And so under the U.S. Supreme Court's approach, you could have, colonial officials going onto Monticello or Mount Vernon and roaming around without a warrant as much as they please. But what Laura argues in her article is actually no, because that house sits on property and extends its protection to the entirety of the property as a historical matter. And so we would say, look, under that interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, the word houses should include what we're currently calling open fields.
Josh, when you're at the church house or the coffee shop, wherever, the public, how much do they know what open fields even is?
It's so they don't know at all about this. And then they were in the same position I was in back in 2020 when I first heard about this. And my first reaction to the idea that the government could put a camera on someone's property and just think it was okay was what the heck? This is America, damn it.
What the Sigma? What the Sigma? Exactly.
That doesn't seem right. And, the more people I tell about this, the more outraged they are. The few folks who push back on this are folks who think that it's somehow anti-law enforcement or anti-game law to litigate these cases. And my response to that is actually pretty simple. I have no issue with game wardens they're government officials. They're just trying to do their job. They've been told they have this power, and so they're using it, right? To try to do the job as well as they can. I don't blame them for that. The problem is not with them. The problem is with the courts for giving them the power in the first place, right? If you give them a 100-foot long leash, they're going to go 100 feet, right? And so the point of the Constitution is to keep their power within some basic guardrails. And our argument is it doesn't make any sense to say you're doing law enforcement or pro-law enforcement in a way that violates the Constitution, right? Law enforcement's important. The Constitution is more important. Those things have to work together.
Hey, maybe you can't answer this. Why New York Times not have any of this on their headlines? Why does there seem to be no mainstream media coverage of this?
It's not terribly surprising. Some of the major publications in this country, right, are from urban markets. They're big cities, and no one owns land in big cities, right? So they're just the people who write for these big publications, by and large, and y'all are excluded. You've of course got a different audience, but they just don't have any familiarity with what most of the country out there actually experiences and the way they actually care about their property, right? And so I think that's a big problem, is that our media market is so urban focused that this issue goes by the wayside. And in fact, I'll just give you an example, not a media example, but just to your coffee shop question. I had a neighbor who was a DC Metro police officer, just 2 houses down from mine. And when I told him about this open fields issue, he was astonished because his approach is, I get a warrant every single time I go onto somebody's private property. Like, that is just my practice. That is what I was trained to do. But he was trained to work in a city, right? And city property is treated differently than rural property.
Interesting.
I guess with this open field concept and the more cases that come up and, this constant drumbeat of stories that hopefully then will spark change. What's your fear if it doesn't? What is does the snowball what is your fear if you don't fight this good fight and get this addressed?
Well, I mean, one thing about the Institute for Justice is that we don't really give up. And so if it were true that I was going to spend the next 5 years losing a bunch of cases, and I don't think it is, but if it were, I would then go to legislatures and sort of use all the information I got from my cases, the deposition testimony, the evidence, the photos, the videos, the cameras, all of that surveillance, and go to legislatures and say, look, this is a problem the courts were not brave enough to solve, but you have to be brave enough to solve it, right? And so it's not like we have only one branch of government at our disposal here. We've got a lot of resources. I think the courts are the best and the most enduring way to fix this problem for generations to come and for the most people. But if that doesn't work, we've got to call on our lawmakers to get this right.
Josh, tell us another story. Give us another example, another case that you've worked on, just so people have some ideas of types of things that you're dealing with.
Yeah. So, I mean, another that comes to mind for me is the one that we just filed in Alabama that I think Chris wrote a story on with my colleague Saranjan Sen. But this is a nice little example of how wide the open fields doctrine is in its scope. And so we've got 3 clients. We've got Regina Williams, we've got Dalton Boley, and we've got Dale Lyles. Now, Regina and Dalton are next door neighbors in a residential neighborhood, like that Josh Highlander story I gave you from Virginia. It's a residential neighborhood. And what's amazing about this residential neighborhood is that all the properties are relatively small. Regina, however, has this family property she's lived on for decades. She was raised there. If you go to the property, and when I drove there, I was astonished to see this, the house she grew up in, that she was raised in as a little girl, she's in her 60s now, still sits on the property. It's crumbling down. It's kind of decrepit, but she lives in a prefab home just a few feet away from that. And this is her sanctuary. This is her family's rooted property that she's been on for her entire life. And she's now got health issues. She's not able to kind of walk around the property and enjoy it the way she used to, but it's about 10 acres, similar to Josh Highlander's. And it's beautiful forested property down behind her house down there in Alabama. It's in North Alabama, actually close to the Tennessee border. And what's amazing for Regina is that a couple of years ago, her neighbor Dalton moved in next door and has 3 little kids. And his sons love to play outside. And Dalton is a combat veteran. And so he's got PTSD. Nature is his sanctuary. Nature is his way of getting away and meditating. He's also a counselor. So he kind of helps other people work through this sort of thing. But the point is, when they moved in, they developed a pretty good relationship with Regina. And she said, you know what? I can't really use this land anymore the way I did when I was younger, but why don't you guys use it? Why don't you guys go out there, camp, meditate, build some trails, play in the woods, like just be a family out in the woods. And they did, and they loved it. And it was a bonding thing for them. And they found privacy and they found enjoyment in nature. And they really, this was like a special sanctuary for this family. And unfortunately, that privacy was shattered over the last couple of years when they realized that game wardens were going onto their property without a warrant and like patrolling through the woods. And Dalton learned about this when one of his cameras on that forested property had been turned around and took a picture of the tree. And initially he was like, why does this camera have a black photo on it? Why would it be turned around? Fortunately for Dalton, he had another camera facing that camera that saw the game warden walking by. And so the game warden, I think, came through, thought he would turn the camera around to avoid being captured and didn't realize he was being captured on a photo from right behind, right? But the point is, all of this has totally changed their relationship with the land. They're not going out there as much. Dalton doesn't allow his kids to go out there unsupervised anymore. Dalton isn't going out and meditating and camping alone because, he was doing that for PTSD. But the whole point was that he knew he wasn't being watched and being surveilled. Now he can't have that peace of mind, right? And so Dalton and Regina are 2 of our plaintiffs who are saying, look, these officials are claiming statutory power in Alabama to go onto this property whenever they want without a warrant. And that's just destroyed our relationship with this land. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we've got Dale Lyles, who owns about 100 acres. I think it's actually 80 of big, sprawling farmland and hunting land down there in Alabama. It's the opposite side of the spectrum, right? but it's still private. It's still his. It's his retirement property. It's his recreational property. And he bought it so he could hunt in retirement with his grandkids, right? So just like Dalton and his family, Dale bought this bigger property to have a special relationship with the land and with his family and to enjoy those remaining years in retirement with people he loves, doing something he loves, which is hunting. And Dale's never had a hunting violation. He's the president of Ducks Unlimited down there. He's clean as a whistle. But the point is, the open fields doctrine treats all of these properties exactly the same. Game wardens are going on to Dalton and Regina's property. Game wardens have been going on to Dale's property, all without their consent, all without a warrant. And we're talking about property that's 10 acres on one side in a residential neighborhood and 80 to 100 acres out in the fields on the other. And so it's really, when you want to think about how do we quantify this problem, my firm actually put out a study last year called Good Fences, Good Luck, where we tried to figure out, what is the actual mathematical scope of this problem, right? What does the open fields doctrine mean in numbers? And the answer is pretty shocking when you map it out. About 96% of all private land in the country is entirely exposed to warrantless searches because of this doctrine. And that's about 1.2 billion acres of land. And so whether we're talking about the 10-acre property, the 80-acre property, a 5,000-acre property, like some of the properties up in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania that I represent in our case up there, it's everything under the sun. It doesn't matter if it's fenced. It doesn't matter if it's farmed. It doesn't matter if you live there. It doesn't matter if you have posted signs up. It doesn't matter. All of it is treated the same, which is open to the government.
So, Josh, if there's an individual out there, a landowner, who thinks they have an open fields case, other than call you, what's your advice for them?
Well, you should call me. But I think the other thing you can do is start to put yourself in a position to fight about this, right? So the better cases, the ones that are going to have legs, where you're really going to be able to vindicate your rights, are going to be cases where you have put up clear signs that you don't want intruders, right? Because courts are not going to want to rule for you and say the government can't come on if you don't even care if private people come on. A lot of states have trespass statutes, right? That say, got to put up purple paint or you got to put up certain signs or fences to exclude the public. So take those steps, look at your state law, take those steps to signal, I'm not okay with intruders coming onto my property. And once you've done that with regard to private people, you don't want private trespassers on, then you're in a better position to say, you know what, I also don't want the government coming on for the same reason. So the first step is take the steps needed to keep intruders out of your property. The second step is once you've done that and the intrusions are still going on, you got to call an attorney, right? Call me. I specialize in this, but there's other folks who work on this in every state. Different states have like think tanks that work on these things. There are private attorneys you can consult. But the most important thing when you contact an attorney about this issue is to ensure they argue under your state constitution. Because right now, the U.S. Supreme Court has taken the Fourth Amendment kind of off the table in this space. And so you have to make sure that your attorney is focused on what your state constitution can do to protect your private rights.
Josh, if you had it, you could just wave a wand and say, okay, this is what needs to happen. What would be the perfect solution? What would be the answer? What would you love to see done on this issue?
Yeah, I think the U.S. Supreme Court needs to overrule its 1924 decision in Hester. I mean, I just think it was wrongly decided. It's the root of all evil in this space, unfortunately. I think every state does have, fortunately, that kind of independent state constitution where we can get some of that protection back, but it's never going to touch those federal officials, right? And so if you want a complete solution to this problem that pulls the rug out from under 100 years of bad precedent, you got to go back to the root and overturn that Hester case and realize that we're not in prohibition anymore, guys.
But how likely is that that's going to happen? I mean, you mentioned it. If you're in an urban area, you don't care about this, and so because even though the majority of us may be in some of these rural areas, how likely is it that you think that this actually gets taken up by the Supreme Court?
Well, if I have everything to say about it, I would think it's likely in the course of my career. We play the long game. This is not. Yeah. This is not bouncing year to year or case to case without a strategy. We've got a long strategy in mind here. In 20 years, 30 years, I hope to be arguing that case at the U.S. Supreme Court. We're laying all the groundwork right now, and that's intentional. So, who knows what the court's going to look like then, but we're going to be ready for it when it is.
Chris, what's your advice? You've covered so many of these cases and in depth. I mean, you've pulled back every single layer possible on some of these stories. So what would your advice be for landowners?
I'd implore them to pay attention to open fields and learn more and more about it. The people involved that are represented by Josh Windham in these 6 states are average Americans. They're just like me and you, and they never expected to be put in this spotlight. I implore people, go learn about open fields.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, I mean, we are actively looking for more of these cases, and we have specific states that are like real priorities for us. So if you live in Texas, if you live in Ohio, if you live in Massachusetts, I mean, these are some of the states that I'm really interested in fighting this fight in. Kentucky's another one.
Why? Why those states? Why those states specifically?
So the main reason is that because the U.S. Supreme Court is so obsessed with what the Fourth Amendment's text says, and the fact that you don't see the word land in there, a lot of our cases are starting with state constitutions that have slightly different wording. And a lot of the cases that states that we work in have the word possessions in their state constitution. And long story short, our argument is land is a possession. And it is. I mean, there's a ton of evidence for that. We've had some success on that already. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in a case I argued, a couple months ago now, is considering whether to overturn a 2007 precedent about whether the word possessions means land or not. And so that argument went really well. I'm optimistic about it, and fingers are crossed. So yeah, these are possession states, and I'd love to litigate more of them.
Yeah, landowners would argue it's possession as well. Think about how much money's been spent on this land. It's just crazy that this can even happen. Okay, Clinton, anything else you wanna end on?
No, I would just say that I think there's proof in the work that Chris does to complement the work that you're doing, Josh, that our audience and that the rural audience really cares about this issue,
right,
that they're trying to follow along because just how much traffic and how much these stories are being read. And I would say that's encouraging to know that more and more people are starting to pay attention to it. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, and you guys are fighting the good fights and trying to share the information and the stories as they go along. And I think it's great. It'll be interesting to watch over the next 10 to 15 years, the kind of success you have and how far this travels.
Well, and the stories are so relatable. It's everyday people, and it's so you can put yourself, especially when I read your stories, Chris, as a landowner, this could easily be me. This could easily be us. It's one of those that really strikes a chord, and it's unfortunate, but the fact that it could happen to any of us, I think, is really what makes this such a hot button issue, Chris.
Hey man, this is fundamental to the Bill of Rights. This is fundamental to who we are as Americans. So Josh Windham, please keep on.
Amen to that.
Thanks, Bob. I guess I'll just close by saying one thing, which is that I think it's really common for folks when I talk to them about this issue who have dealt with it personally to say, like, this is just something we have to deal with. We've been dealing with it for a long time. Like, it's just the way the world works? And the answer is no. Like, the world doesn't have to work this way. You can stand up. We are here to help you stand up, and like, don't accept, these intrusions on your privacy, on your pursuit of happiness. Like, don't let that go by the wayside when you have people who are willing to fight for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a good lawyer does. He has a great closing argument there.
That's good. We're going to get you to write headlines for us there pretty soon, though, because I like the name of your paper. What was it? Good Fences, Good Luck? Is that the name of the paper? That's great. I love it.
Do you need a side hustle? Because we could really use you.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm always happy to have a side hustle.
Nice. Nice. All right. Awesome. Well, Josh, Chris, thank you both for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all.
Yeah, appreciate you both for being here. And we want to thank all of our viewers for joining us on Unscripted this week. And, of course, our sponsors at BASF.
I'm empowered. I'm about to go booby trap my entire property, Clinton. I feel empowered right now. We're going to take on the government. We're going to do this together.
You're just going to end up with bear spray and a string that's you're going to catch a leprechaun or something.
I mean, right before 4th of July, there is nothing more empowering than what Josh and Chris shared with us, Clinton. Right?
We're in that great window between Memorial Day and 4th of July where you really feel that patriotism.
Oh, I feel it every day, but even more
you
today,
do.
Clinton.
Yeah,
I'm
you
empowered.
do. All right, everybody. Obviously unscripted. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Until next time, live your life unscripted.
Thanks for joining us. You can dive into more of Unscripted on Farm Journal's YouTube channel and listen to it anywhere podcasts are found. I'm Clinton Griffiths.
And I'm Tyne Morgan. From all of us here at Farm Journal, keep it real as you live your life unscripted.
Unscripted is a production of Farm Journal Studios, where no one grows alone.